Imagine you're sitting at your family's secluded lake cabin, enjoying the calm and peaceful atmosphere, the kind of place where you go to escape the noise of the world. You're relaxed, maybe even drifting into a sense of safety, when suddenly, out of nowhere, your quiet retreat is interrupted by an unexpected and increasingly heated confrontation. A local teenager approaches, demanding that you let him into your private property, acting like he has every right to be there. When you firmly refuse, he doesn't take it well. His attitude escalates quickly, and soon his mother, a woman who seems to think she runs the neighborhood, is involved. She starts throwing threats, calling you unreasonable, and when that doesn't work, she does the unthinkable, she calls the cops. You're caught off guard, your peaceful day suddenly disrupted, but what she doesn't know is the wild twist to this whole situation. This isn't just any ordinary family cabin, and you're not just some random person she can push around. You see, my family doesn't just have a normal background, we have connections that most people only dream about. The moment the cops show up, it's clear this is about to get a lot more complicated than she ever imagined. What she thought was a simple power play turned into a confrontation she wasn't prepared for, and trust me, it wasn't just her pride on the line. Let's just say, she was about to find out that messing with the wrong people can have some serious consequences, and not in the way she thought. I've spent years enjoying the peace and quiet of our family cabin by the lake. It's always been my sanctuary, a place where I could get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life, where the only sounds are the rustling of the trees and the gentle lapping of the water. My family built this cabin decades ago, and it's been passed down through generations. It's our little slice of heaven, far from the noise and stress of the world, where we could relax, recharge, and be together. But this year, things were different. The area around the lake had started to change. A new neighborhood had popped up nearby, and with it, a new set of people who didn't quite understand the boundaries or respect the privacy we valued. It all started when I noticed a kid, probably in his late teens, wandering around the property. At first, I didn't think much of it, I figured he was just out exploring. But then he walked right up to the cabin and started making demands. "You're not using this, right?" he asked, his tone sharp and entitled. He went on to say how he was pretty sure he had the right to use the cabin or at least the land surrounding it. I'm not sure what made him think he could just waltz onto private property and start claiming rights, but it didn't sit right with me. I politely told him it was private property, and there was no way he was getting access. That's when the situation took a sharp turn. The kid's attitude shifted instantly. He got defensive, starting to argue that it didn't matter, that he had been told by some other neighbors that this land wasn't really off-limits. He didn't take no for an answer, and as much as I tried to remain calm, it was clear he wasn't going to back down. That's when his mother showed up. She was a piece of work, to say the least. A woman who clearly felt entitled to whatever she wanted. She stormed up, her face red, demanding to know why her son couldn't use the land. I explained the situation again, but she didn't want to hear it. She started yelling, accusing me of being unreasonable, of being difficult for no good reason. Then, without any hesitation, she pulled out her phone and called the cops. As if that was going to intimidate me. Little did she know, this wasn't just any ordinary cabin, and I wasn't some random person she could push around. She had no idea who she was messing with, and by the time she realized, it was already too late. Things escalated quickly, and before I knew it, the situation was spiraling out of control. I thought it was just a misunderstanding, that the kid would realize he was crossing boundaries, but that was far from the case. He didn't back down, instead, he grew even more insistent. He started raising his voice, accusing me of being unfair and unreasonable, as though I was the one in the wrong for not letting him onto our private property. "This is a free country, you can't just deny people access to land like this," he said, crossing his arms and glaring at me like I was the one causing trouble. It was almost comical at first. I tried to stay calm, explaining that it wasn't about fairness, but about respect for private property, our property, specifically. But the more I explained, the more he pushed back, his tone getting louder and more aggressive. I could feel the tension building, and I knew it was only a matter of time before things got worse. That's when his mother, the infamous HOA Karen, came storming over from their house, her face already flushed with anger. She didn't waste any time with pleasantries or even trying to understand the situation. The first thing she did was start shouting at me, accusing me of being difficult and disrespectful. I was caught off guard by her outburst. There was no reason for her to act this way. I had been polite, calm, and firm with her son. But she wasn't hearing any of it. "You're just one of those entitled people who thinks they own everything," she snapped, her voice rising in anger. "This land isn't just for you, you know. You're being unreasonable, and I won't stand for it." I tried to tell her that the kid had no business being on the property, but she wasn't listening. Her eyes were wild with rage, and it was clear she wasn't going to back down either. I'll be honest, I wasn't prepared for this. I thought this was a simple misunderstanding that would blow over quickly, but now it felt like I was being attacked for no reason. Her son was getting more and more belligerent, and now she was fueling the fire. I stayed calm and told her that I would not allow her son on the property, but that only seemed to make her angrier. "You'll regret this," she warned, her tone turning more threatening. "I'll make sure you never get any peace again. You think you're in charge? I know people. You're going to regret messing with my family." I was starting to get fed up. This wasn't just an argument anymore, it was a full-on confrontation, and she was not backing down. Her threats weren't just empty words, it was clear that she thought she had some kind of power over the situation, and that's when she pulled out her phone. With a dramatic flair, she dialed the police, her eyes never leaving mine. "I'm calling the cops. You're trespassing, and I'm reporting you for harassment," she barked into the phone, already making the situation seem a lot more serious than it was. I couldn't believe what was happening. The woman had lost all sense of reason, and now, instead of calmly resolving a misunderstanding, we were about to involve law enforcement over a simple property dispute. "I'm going to get you in trouble for this," she repeated, her finger pointing at me accusingly. "You'll see." She hung up and smirked at me, as if she had won. Now, I don't know if she thought I was intimidated by the idea of cops showing up, but in that moment, I couldn't help but feel how absurd it all was. I knew that in a situation like this, involving law enforcement could go in any direction. The idea that this woman, who clearly didn't understand the basic concept of private property, was about to drag police officers into something so petty felt almost unreal. And yet, there I was, standing on the doorstep of a conflict that was getting more ridiculous by the second. But I didn't show any fear. If anything, the idea that she thought a call to the cops would make me fold only made me more determined to stand my ground. And that's when the situation took another turn. Instead of calling the cops to resolve things, she had essentially made everything much worse. The emotional buildup was reaching its peak, and I could sense the tension in the air, thick and charged. Her son was now standing behind her, grinning as if they had already won. But it was the kind of grin that felt more like a challenge than a victory. She had clearly overplayed her hand, escalating the conflict to a level that didn't make sense. I wasn't backing down, and neither was she. The absurdity of it all, the over-the-top threats, the false accusations, the escalating situation over a simple property dispute, made the whole thing feel like a surreal drama unfolding in real time. It was getting harder to believe that this was really happening. It felt almost like some weird social experiment to test how far someone would go to feel in charge. As the minutes ticked by, the situation continued to build in intensity, and I could feel the weight of her threats settling in. The idea of cops arriving and this ridiculous argument turning into a legal issue was becoming more real by the second. And yet, I still didn't back down. If anything, her threats were only making me more determined to finish what we'd started, a battle of wills that was about to blow up in ways no one, least of all her, expected. As the minutes ticked by, I could feel the tension in the air like a tightrope, stretched just about to snap. The situation had escalated beyond what I had imagined. This woman, her son, and now the looming presence of the law enforcement that they were so certain would be on their side, it was all starting to feel like an episode of a show I wasn't supposed to be in. But what she didn't know, what neither she nor her son could possibly fathom, was that this was no ordinary family cabin, and I was no ordinary person. This wasn't a situation where you could simply bully someone into submission and expect no consequences. The truth was, my family had some very serious connections in law enforcement. They weren't just casual ties or distant acquaintances, they were deeply embedded in agencies that held far more power than most people could even comprehend. What seemed like a petty dispute over land and property wasn't just a matter of personal pride for me. It was about something far bigger. The deeper I dug in my heels, the more I realized that this situation was spiraling in a direction they didn't understand, one that would eventually make them regret every word they'd said. But I wasn't in a hurry to reveal just how far my family's reach went. I kept my cool as the woman stood there, talking loudly into her phone, claiming I was the one being unreasonable, refusing to let her son on my private property. Her voice was a mix of arrogance and frustration, as though she believed her threats would be enough to force me to cave. But while she raged on, something deep inside me started to feel like this might be the perfect moment to introduce a little bit of reality into the situation. It wasn't just the land I was protecting, it was the principle behind it. This wasn't just some random encounter. I knew she thought she was dealing with an average person, someone she could intimidate and manipulate with a few sharp words. But she was wrong. She had no idea who she was dealing with. As her calls grew more frantic, a thought crossed my mind: I needed to buy some time, to really make her realize that messing with the wrong person could have some serious consequences. I wasn't going to threaten her like she had threatened me, instead, would let the situation unfold in a way that would make her regret underestimating me. I excused myself and calmly walked back inside the cabin. There was no rush. I knew exactly who I needed to call to make this entire situation turn in my favor. The woman's voice was still echoing in my ears, her demands growing louder and more insistent, but I wasn't listening anymore. It wasn't that I didn't care about the outcome, it was just that I knew how this would play out. As I picked up my phone, I dialed a number I knew by heart, one that had always been just a phone call away. It was a number I had never used in a situation like this before, but today felt different. Today, I needed to remind her, and her son, exactly who they were messing with. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. "Yeah?" The voice was calm, authoritative, a familiar voice. "It's me," I said. "I need a favor. We've got a situation here." It wasn't long before my call was being routed through the right channels. The quiet assurance that I had learned to expect from the people I was connected to seeped into the situation. I knew I wasn't just some guy trying to defend his cabin anymore. This was becoming a whole different ball game. I didn't have to explain the details, it wasn't necessary. The connections were strong enough to know what needed to be done. The woman outside still had no idea that the very forces she was trying to manipulate were already being put to work behind the scenes. Within minutes, the tension in the air shifted, and it became clear that she wasn't just about to call any officer, she had been setting up a confrontation that she hadn't prepared for. When I walked back outside, I could see that her whole demeanor had shifted too. She was still talking a mile a minute, but there was a noticeable unease in her voice now. The mother had become the one who was trying to save face, to hold on to some semblance of control. And she couldn't. I had made the call, and I knew that when my family's influence started to show, everything she had worked for in the last few minutes would crumble. It wasn't long before the situation took another turn. She suddenly paused mid-sentence, looking over my shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of something. I followed her gaze. Just down the driveway, I could see a black SUV pulling up, not a police car, but a vehicle that felt different. The car was unmarked, sleek, almost intimidating in its silence. I could feel the shift in the air. The mother's face went pale. Her son, who had been standing there, still acting like he was in charge, now took a step back. I knew the second that SUV pulled up, she realized something had changed. The officer who stepped out of the vehicle wasn't just some beat cop. He wasn't here to settle a petty property dispute. He was here because someone far more important than she was had made a call. I didn't say a word as I stood there, letting the moment sink in. She was looking at the officer, then back at me, and back at him again. Her eyes darted between us, clearly trying to piece together what was happening, but her brain wasn't quite able to catch up with the reality that was unfolding in front of her. The officer didn't introduce himself at first. He didn't need to. He simply walked over to me and nodded in greeting, as if we were old friends. To her, it must have seemed like some kind of strange coincidence, but I knew the truth. She didn't realize yet, but it was coming. "I think we've got this situation under control," the officer said to me, giving me a reassuring glance. "If you need anything else, just let me know." The look on her face was priceless. Her son was already staring at the officer, eyes wide with confusion and panic. The pieces were starting to click together for her, but it was too late to turn back now. She had no idea that the person she had just tried to bully into submission was someone with much deeper connections. Connections that could make this entire situation go from a small nuisance to something far more significant. And then, as the officer stepped back, I gave her one last, knowing glance. "I don't think your son will be bothering anyone here again," I said, my voice calm and steady, the weight of my family's influence hanging in the air like a silent threat. The look of realization in her eyes said everything. She knew now, and I could almost see the regret settle in. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was clear she had underestimated the wrong person. As the officer approached, the weight of the situation really started to sink in. The air felt thick, heavy with the kind of tension that only comes when two worlds collide, the everyday world of neighborhood disputes and the hidden world of serious law enforcement connections that I had been quietly operating within. The SUV that had pulled up wasn't just another vehicle in the neighborhood, it had been carefully chosen to send a message, and that message was starting to hit home. The mother, still standing there with her phone in her hand, now had her eyes locked onto the officer who had just exited the unmarked vehicle. Her bravado from earlier, the shouting, the threats, the confident accusations, all of that seemed to drain from her face in an instant. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion, and then to fear. She hadn't realized yet, but it was clear she was beginning to sense that something had just shifted in her favor. The officer, calm and collected, didn't make a show of his presence. He wasn't there to make a scene. Instead, he stood quietly by me, surveying the situation with an air of detached professionalism. He didn't ask the woman for her side of the story, he didn't need to. He already knew how this was going to play out. But the confusion on her face was evident. She looked between the officer, the SUV, and me, her brain trying to make sense of the situation. I could see her trying to piece together the scenario, her hand still clutching her phone tightly as though it were a lifeline, her lips pursed and trembling slightly. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" the officer asked, his tone polite but firm. He didn't shout or make any gestures, he simply spoke, and the authority in his voice was enough to make her hesitate before answering. The mother, visibly shaken now, struggled to maintain the upper hand she had thought she would have. For the first time since I'd encountered her, there was a crack in her demeanor. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't demanding, she was trying to regain some semblance of control, but she could already feel it slipping through her fingers. The officer didn't respond to her rambling, didn't react to the accusations she threw at me. He simply asked her again, calmly, "Ma'am, what's going on?" At that moment, I could feel her wheels turning in her head. She had been so certain, so sure of herself only moments ago. She had called the cops expecting to intimidate me, believing that her connections in the neighborhood, maybe her HOA ties, her influence, would make her bulletproof. But now, with this officer standing next to me, everything she thought she knew was being challenged. She wasn't in charge here. She wasn't the one with the power. The officer turned slightly toward me, his gaze briefly meeting mine before he addressed her. The look he gave me wasn't just one of professional courtesy, it was a look that said, "I've got this." And in that moment, I knew exactly what was happening. Her entire world was starting to unravel, and she was finally starting to realize that the power dynamic had shifted in a way she could never have anticipated. She stammered at first, trying to explain that I was being unreasonable, that I had refused her son access to the cabin and that I had been uncooperative. Her voice was shaking now, her threats from earlier falling flat. She was losing her grip, and with each word she spoke, it was clear that she was fumbling to keep up with the growing realization that she was not the one calling the shots. The officer let her speak, but his silence was deafening, and it made her increasingly uncomfortable. She began to sense that whatever was happening here wasn't a simple neighborhood spat. It wasn't just a misunderstanding that could be settled with a few angry words and a call to the cops. Finally, the officer turned to me, and in that brief moment of eye contact, I could feel the subtle shift in the air. He didn't need to ask any questions, the look he gave me was all I needed to know that my call had been received and understood. It was like an unspoken signal, a quiet confirmation that everything was in motion. As if to punctuate the moment, he took out his phone, pressed a few buttons, and then held it up to his ear. The mother was watching all of this with wide eyes, and I could see the panic starting to creep into her expression. She was no longer in control of the situation. In fact, she was now completely at its mercy. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm yet polite, "I'm going to need you to step aside for a moment." He didn't ask her to leave, he simply stated it as a fact. There was no room for negotiation, no space for her to argue. The authority in his voice made it clear that she wasn't about to get away with her tantrum or her manipulation. "We're going to need to verify some things before we move forward with any more actions." Her response was nothing short of a stammer. "Verify, what? I'm just trying to get him to leave. He's trespassing." The officer didn't acknowledge her protest. Instead, he walked a few steps to the side, still talking into his phone, as if everything happening in front of her was a normal, everyday occurrence. The woman's eyes darted from the officer to me and back again. She was desperately trying to read the situation, trying to figure out what had gone wrong. She had been so sure that her call to the cops would settle the score, but now, standing in the shadow of real law enforcement power, she realized her mistake. She had called the wrong people, people who were far more serious than she could have ever imagined. The realization hit her like a freight train, and I could see it in her eyes. The officer finally finished his call, slipping his phone back into his pocket with a smooth, practiced motion. He turned to her, his face a mask of professionalism. "Ma'am," he began, "this situation is going to be handled. You need to step aside and allow us to speak with the property owner." It wasn't just the officer's tone that made her falter, it was the quiet confidence behind it. The unmistakable feeling that she was about to lose, that she had underestimated the situation from the very beginning. She faltered again, trying to regain some control, but it was too late. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and she was no longer in charge of the narrative. The officer wasn't taking orders from her, he was taking orders from a far higher authority. At that point, I saw the color drain from her face as the weight of the situation finally sunk in. She knew she had made a grave mistake. The officer turned to me again, giving me a respectful nod as though to confirm that he had done what was needed. "You're free to go about your business," he said, his eyes lingering on the woman for a moment, as if to silently remind her that she wasn't going to get away with making baseless accusations. The look on her face was one of realization, the kind of realization that came with the sharp sting of being caught in a lie and a misguided attempt at power. As the officer walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had come here, expecting to push me around and make demands like she had all the power. But in the end, it was clear who had the upper hand. She wasn't going to mess with us again. As the officer walked away, the air between us seemed to shift completely. What had once been a confrontation, with the tension and anger brewing over an innocent family dispute, had now turned into an unsettling silence, the calm after the storm. The mother, still standing there with her mouth slightly agape, was in disbelief. She hadn't just lost the argument, she had lost her entire sense of control, and with it, whatever power she thought she had over this situation. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Her face was an unhealthy mix of confusion, frustration, and anger. I could see it in her eyes, the moment she realized that she had gone too far. The consequences of underestimating someone like me, or more specifically, someone from my family, were starting to sink in. It wasn't just the fact that the officer was walking away, it was the weight of the unspoken message that followed. By the time the SUV had pulled away, and the officer had disappeared down the gravel road, she had learned exactly who she was up against. She had mistaken the situation for a simple power struggle, where a threatening phone call and some loud accusations could get her what she wanted. But now, as the officer's vehicle faded into the distance, the truth had settled in. My family's reach wasn't just limited to property ownership or some random local influence. We were woven into the fabric of a much larger, much more powerful system that most people, especially people like her, couldn't even begin to fathom. "Listen," I said, finally breaking the silence between us. "I think we've had enough of this. You've made your point, whatever that point was, and I've made mine. But let's just be clear, this isn't the kind of situation you want to escalate any further. You might want to let your son know he's not welcome on private property." My voice was calm, but the finality of it was clear. This wasn't a negotiation, and there was no longer any room for argument. Her eyes widened in disbelief, as if she couldn't fully comprehend what had just transpired. You can't just do this," she stammered, her earlier bravado replaced by a nervous energy. You think you can get away with this?" I didn't flinch. "Actually, I think you've just realized what happens when you mess with the wrong people." My words hung in the air for a moment, as I saw the small, subtle change in her demeanor. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed to grasp the full extent of the mistake she'd made. Her face turned red, her fists clenching at her sides, but it was too late. The damage had been done. She muttered something incoherent, her voice rising again in indignation, but it was clear that whatever words she chose now would be nothing but empty. She could feel it, and I could see it in the way her shoulders slumped, the way her defiant posture slowly turned to one of reluctant acceptance. The truth was, she had no way of winning this. Her son, who had been standing off to the side, his arms crossed and his eyes filled with defiance, now looked like a deer caught in the headlights. It was clear that his mother's attempt to play the victim, to rally against me, had failed spectacularly. He was watching the entire exchange unfold, and I could see the guilt and shame creeping into his expression as well. This wasn't a simple lesson in respect, this was a lesson in knowing your place, and they had both learned it the hard way. After another long, tense silence, the mother finally turned to her son, muttering something about needing to leave. It was the first sign of surrender I had seen from her all day. "Let's go," she snapped at him, and without another word, they both turned to walk back toward their house, the son trailing behind her with his shoulders hunched, clearly humiliated. I watched them for a few moments, their defeat hanging in the air between us, before I turned back to the cabin, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. But the resolution wasn't just about the victory for me. It wasn't just about the moment where she realized she had overplayed her hand. It was about the message it sent. I hadn't needed to resort to any physical confrontation or major legal threats. I hadn't needed to raise my voice or make grand statements. All it had taken was a few subtle words, a calm demeanor, and the quiet assurance that comes with knowing the right people, the people who had the power to make her regret ever even considering challenging me. And as the dust settled and the evening stretched on, I knew that this was going to be a story that she would never forget, a story she'd tell her neighbors, her friends, and anyone who would listen. But it wouldn't be the story she wanted to tell. The HOA Karen, who thought she could use her neighborhood influence to intimidate people, had just learned an incredibly valuable lesson: that power isn't about how loud you can shout or how many people you can threaten. It's about who you know, who's got your back, and what kind of pull you really have when it matters. In the end, they both left, defeated and humiliated, having learned the hard way that messing with someone whose family has those kinds of connections wasn't a good idea. The whole confrontation had played out like a chess match, and the pieces had all fallen into place in a way that left no room for them to recover. The power dynamics had shifted so dramatically that there was no chance of them coming back from this. The HOA Karen and her son had tried to use intimidation, threats, and petty manipulations to force their way onto my land. But in the end, they realized that they weren't dealing with someone who could be easily pushed around. They had thought their position of power would be enough to win them the day, but they had underestimated how serious and far-reaching the true power could be. And as for me, I didn't need to make a big deal of it. I didn't need to boast or rub it in their faces. The situation was resolved quietly, efficiently, and most importantly, without any further escalation. But deep down, I knew they wouldn't forget what happened. The next time they thought about making a move on someone, the lesson they learned today would echo in the back of their minds, reminding them that not everyone is as easy to push around as they might think. The HOA Karen and her son would likely think twice before challenging anyone else in the future, and that, in itself, was a win. So, next time you find yourself in a situation where someone's trying to push you around or take advantage of you, remember this story. You never really know who's on the other side, and sometimes, the last person you'd expect is the one who can turn the whole situation on its head. Don't let people intimidate you with empty threats or make you feel like you're powerless just because they think they have the upper hand. Stand your ground, stay calm, and remember, there's always more to the story than meets the eye. If you ever feel like you're outmatched, just think about what happened here, because, trust me, there's always a way to level the playing field. If you want more crazy, unexpected stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You don't want to miss the wild stories I've got coming your way, and trust me, some of them will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power dynamics and conflict resolution. I'd love to hear what you would have done in my situation. Was calling the cops a bit much, or was it totally justified? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Have you ever faced a similar situation? What was your strategy? I can't wait to see your responses, and as always, thank you for being here.